everyone.
Hello, we are Agata and Lugne, two students from the University of Groningen. During the last couple of months, we had an opportunity to take on very interesting project in our anthropology course.
So, you're asking what this project is about?
Yes, it was actually very engaging. We have been researching how gender and emotions interact in the personal experience of ethnographers.
Yes, indeed. And we had this amazing opportunity to interview six researchers, three of them male and three female, and they had rich experiences in participant observation, which was just a pleasure.
And what we have found, you ask? Well, many things. Let's dive in.
A literature background.
Let's start the same way we began our research, with a quick literature review. In the introduction to the book Emotions in the Field, which was written in 2010, Dimitra Spencer addresses the way emotionality and personal experiences were perceived in anthropology from the 70s up until the current day. She contrasts scientific optimists who aim to standardize techniques and replicate methods in anthropology with self reflexive theorists that focused more on positionality and reflexivity of the researcher. In simple words, scientific optimists neglected the emotional or personal part in the research, deeming it unscientific. On the other hand, the proponents of the reflexive methods, such as Rabinov and Krapanzo, analyzed researchers' limits on objectivity, argued that knowledge production is intersubjective, created by the interaction between the researcher and the participant. By the mid 90s, Hastrup and Herwig furthered this by positing that fieldwork experience itself makes knowledge through, quote, radical interpretation.
Spencer follows up with the reflection on the current tendencies in anthropology, otherwise called the affective turn. Quote, it is important to note here that today we see not only a shift in the way in which emotions are addressed as a form of knowledge within anthropology, but we also see that how anthropologists employ the notion of emotions has transformed over time as our approach to knowledge has transformed. End quote. In a nutshell, after such a complex development in the way emotions are seen in fieldwork, today ethnographers are way more keen on addressing them and treating them as a respective part of knowledge production.
So, how do ethnographers actually gather their knowledge?
Well, that's a good question, Ugne. As Michael Jackson, and not the Michael Jackson you think, in the book Emotions in the Field, says, quote, understanding comes of separation and pain. To understand is to suffer the eclipse of everything you know, all that you have, and all that you are. End quote.
Oh wow, that sounds a bit drastic, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, well, let's unpack what he actually means, shall we? So, what I think he is saying is that to understand what other people think, you first need to get rid of your own knowledge and presumptions. You need to bracket and question basically everything you think you know.
Yeah, this process does indeed sound a bit painful, but like, do we need to be that dramatic?
I mean, you're right, it may be phrased a bit differently, but also none of our interviewees said that their fieldwork was easy and pleasant, so he does make a valid point, it seems.
Yes, to add on this, according to James Davies' chapter from the same book, the reality of fieldwork is unique to every researcher. Seeking objectivity is hence unattainable goal. Ethnographers are records of how researchers experience the reality there and not how it really is.
You're right. This almost phenomenological idea was also mentioned by our interviewees, who, when asked whether anthropologists should strive for objectivity, said it wasn't really possible.
Exactly. It all boils down to a unique ethnographic experience. Lucky for us, Carol Warren and Jennifer Hackney elaborate on that experience in their book, Gender Issues in Ethnography.
You're right. What I found out specifically helpful was their chapter on interviewing and gender. I could see a lot of parallels in there with both what our interviewees told us and with our own experiences of interviewing them.
Yes, very relatable indeed. I think that the most relevant part was where they talked about the researcher being assigned various roles throughout their stay.
Exactly. Those roles can be, for example, a confidant, best friend, the honorary man, expert, authority, or a child. And those roles change across various contexts and situations. They are not static at all.
What I found especially interesting was the description of the child role. What they write is that when the interviewer was perceived in the child role, their interviewers would have the upper hand and do things such as quizzing the interviewer or provide instructions and further readings to them. On top of that, interviewees acted towards the child slash interviewer with a quote, a sense of trust, openness, and sincere helpfulness, such as the type offered to children in our society, end quote.
Yeah. Does it remind you of something?
Yeah, maybe that is slightly how we felt when interviewing researchers that were older and more experienced than us. They really wanted to help us and they were very honest and sincere, but they also disputed some of our questions and tended to provide long explanations on various anthropological concepts they mentioned.
I think that overall this positionality was beneficial to us, as it is quite close to what Warren and Hackney characterize as the desired role in this context, which they call, quote, socially acceptable incompetent.
Lucky us. I think this literature review prepared us well for what there is to come.
You're right. Let's now focus on our own research project.
Before we start with our findings, we think it's important to mention that ethnography is a process. Nothing is ever stable. Emotions, relationships, expectations develop as the researcher stays and engages with the community.
Yes, exactly. And also about emotions. It's good to keep in mind that, as Michael Jackson in the book Emotions in the Field noted, emotions are not unique to a person, they are socially constructed and performed. When talking about different cultures, we cannot assume they feel or express themselves the same way as we do.
Yeah, and it's not only about emotions. A little disclaimer. Our research relies on a binary understanding of gender. This wasn't a political choice, but a practical and a cultural one. The societies we looked at are deeply permeated by binary roles. It's the lens through which they see partnership, jealousy, and social life.
Yeah, and we also didn't get our hands on any genderqueer researchers, so we were kind of stuck with men and female cis research.
Yeah, good point. Okay, so now let's really start.
Gender limitations.
First, we found that gender can be quite limiting when doing research, didn't we, Agata?
Yes, indeed, in many dimensions. Limit number one, access to research topics and social spheres.
You have a limited amount of places you are allowed to enter and participate in as a man or a woman. So, for instance, male researchers were easily accepted to join in locals hunting, harvesting, or physical work, while felt like they did not belong to the woman dominated activities such as sewing, cooking, or sitting by the fire with the children. And it works out the other way around with the women and male dominated space.
Yes, one researcher puts it very clearly, quote, gender really impacts when you're doing ethnographic fieldwork. Really impacts the way you construct your relationships. We deal with different issues and the access that we have. End quote.
Exactly. And exactly. And it's not only about the researcher's gender, but also about their informants and gatekeepers, because you can only go as far as your context reach, right?
Right. And in our research findings, relationships with gatekeepers were specifically influential for female researchers.
Indeed, because we also noticed the gender imbalance in power dynamics. Of course, that could be connected to the researchers studying strongly patriarchal cultures, which made the gender power dynamics even more apparent.
Good point. And from noticing these power dynamics emerged the duh, 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 limitation number two. Women had to prove themselves.
All of the women we interviewed mentioned things they had to do to prove themselves as professional and capable. For 2 out of 3 researchers, it meant clothing codes or recording devices they brought with them to look serious. In one case, female researcher reported she had to debate her position with local men. What was noticeable was that none of the men mentioned having to prove their credibility as scholars.
Good observation. Talking more about women researchers. Limitation number 3, danger, appears a lot. Female researchers mentioned feeling restricted by the safety precautions they had to undertake, such as not being able to go alone for a walk in the morning or evening. They also pointed out the threat of sexual harassment or possible sexual expectations that usually, but not exclusively, of course, stem from men towards women.
Whereas the male researchers took time to point out how brave female researchers are, how dangerous it can be for them, especially in places such as Amazonian forest. One researcher even said he doesn't think he would be able to do research he did if he were a woman. Quote, "It's important to say that I'm not sure that it would be safe for a woman to be in this region. It's not a safe place. And I think that this is especially true for women." End quote.
So now we covered our findings on gender limitations. Let's now move to another section, gender expectations. Finding number 1, female researchers were expected to perform their gender more.
This was a big part of what female researchers noted. Especially researchers working in Christian societies had to wear skirts and act in a modest way, kneel before the men, etc. Otherwise, they would not be allowed in. All the women felt the social pressure to perform their, so to say, femininity, whereas 2 out of 3 men told us they actually didn't feel any pressure to perform in a masculine way.
That is true, but it is also important to note that while women were explicitly forced to oblige to their gender roles, which often went against their personal opinions and values, men also sometimes reported not feeling comfortable with the masculine role they had to perform, such as laughing at a crude joke, dealing with stress in performatively relaxed manner, lifting heavy things, and helping with physical labor.
You are definitely right. And here's where the second finding comes in.
Finding number 2. For men, gender expectations are embedded in socialization.
Fill us in on that.
Sure, it is a bit more complex. You see, 2 out of 3 male researchers are perceived as quote unquote bad men.
And what does this being a bad man refer to?
A bad man in this context is someone who is not perceived as fully capable or of fulfilling the masculine role. As one of the male researchers put it, quote, "I'm not very muscular. I'm not strong. I'm not hardworking. I'm not threatening. Not really. So people were puzzled by the way I looked as a man." End quote. But it's not only the appearances or qualities. A quote unquote bad man could also mean someone who is too foreign for them to understand. Another researcher puts it like this, quote, "They had no idea what to make of me. They did not understand me at all. They don't even have a category. I might as well have been from another planet, you know?" End quote.
Okay, but why do we say gender expectations are embedded in socialization for men?
This is where we had some discussion. When female researchers had very rigid guidelines on how to perform their gender in society and could adopt only one role if they wanted to be in the community, male researchers could at least choose from several roles and still be accepted. Even if they were quote unquote a bad man, they still were seen as prospective husbands or godfathers to their children.
Okay, go on.
So it takes us to a conclusion that for the man, it might have been more about the cultural part and socialization, not simply rigid expectations on appearance or inequalities that mattered. For instance, connecting with the local man, choking while having a drink, laughing together, and teasing each other was mentioned in all the conversations with the male researchers. One researcher had an observation that sums this up, quote, "The male culture is all about telling jokes and sort of making fun of each other." End quote.
Very interesting. It is so it's more whether you participate in their social realm and do you laugh with them, can you connect with them?
Exactly. And it's also ambiguous. Well, some researchers felt fine to adhere to this, One other researcher explicitly addressed it as emotionally heavy. He told us, quote, and they're laughing, and I'm trying to join in, and I do catch myself doing that. I do catch myself kind of trying, perhaps falsely attempting, to be part of the team by emoting in that way, by being jovial and laughing when in reality, in my head, I'm like, I gotta get inside, I'm freezing, I'm exhausted, I'm hurting, end quote.
Right. So as a result, we have interpreted these situations as peer pressure scenarios or just public social rules that men had to undertake to be able to do research.
Yes, indeed. And from this finding, we delved deeper into what social pressures mean for gender performances.
I can feel a third finding coming.
You're correct.
Finding number 3. What is publicly expected might be privately negotiated.
Please elaborate.
We had a very interesting discovery that one of our researchers pointed out. It is a public and private divide.
And what do we mean by that?
It tells about what is expected in public not necessarily being the same in the private realm. One of the researchers encountered this firsthand during her fieldwork. At the time, she found herself navigating a social environment with very specific gendered expectations, norms that, as a feminist, she found to be in direct tension with her own values. But here's where it got nuanced. When we asked how she managed that tension, she pointed to Pierre Bourdieu's framework of the public and private divide. She observed that while certain gender performances were required in the public eye, those expectations often shifted within the private sphere. She suggested that what we see on the surface of a culture isn't always the full story of what's happening behind the public gaze, where the rules might be negotiated.
Interesting. Of course, we can only take it as an interpretation, but it adds another analytical layer to it, doesn't it?
It does.
I feel like all of these findings really show us how ethnographic fieldwork is embedded in dichotomies public and private, social behaviors versus personal emotions, expectations on gender versus personal values. I think most of the analyzed situations reveal that what is beneficial to the research is often detrimental or challenging to the researcher as an emotional human being.
Here you touched on the gist of it, our main finding.
What is good for the researcher may hurt the research, and vice versa. The dichotomies.
Is it really so black and white?
Let's unpack it. Dichotomy number 1, age. Being a young researcher.
We found that whilst being a young woman puts you in a situation where it is harder to maintain your boundaries uncrossed, it is described as actually very profitable for the research, as one of our interviewees put it. Quote, and when you are young, that is an easier position, so to speak, because you are also seen as vulnerable, especially when you're a woman. Whereas now that I'm older, people relate to me differently, more like an authority. So they don't see you maybe as vulnerable, but maybe somebody who's sort of demanding. So how other people see you is quite important to reflect on, end quote.
Fascinating. Especially when we look at it from broader perspective, right? You clearly see the dichotomy between what is good for the researcher versus for the research itself. And that's what I think all of our subjects mentioned actually is.
Dichotomy number 2, balance the personal and the professional.
I believe that is exactly what makes ethnography so challenging at times.
Yes, indeed. And now we are talking not only about being vulnerable and participating in possibly traumatizing endeavors, but also about other dichotomies, such as balancing the double sided nature of the relationships with the people you study. As one of the anthropologists puts it, quote, it's weird because it's such a personal experience, but also a professional experience, which is like the weird gray area in anthropology. That it was like 2 years of my deep life, but it was also like a job, end quote.
Another aspect of this weird dichotomy is what one of our interviewees called the double consciousness, meaning having to maintain this kind of meta overview of the culture whilst actively participating in it too. She said, quote, you can't expect to feel comfortable doing field work because you always have a double consciousness to start with, even if you're doing it in your own environment because you are both observing and participating. And in most settings, your goal is different. You are doing research, other people are just living and doing whatever it is that they are doing in that setting. So that is always a bit uncomfortable. You have another agenda. And then there's, of course, the discomfort of being different.
Yes, exactly. It kind of sounds like this exhausting nightmare where you need to be hyper conscious of everything that happens because indeed you are different and you need to balance between being accepted by the community and conducting your research.
Exactly. Remember what that one researcher taught us about trying to navigate a foreign society? Quote, it's like driving down the road with no headlights in the darkness. And you're like, I think I'm on the road here, but I don't really know what's under the car right now. End
Oh
quote.
la la. Imagine having to go through it all while still trying to maintain professionalism.
Yeah, no wonder most of our interviewees recalled concealing their emotions and feeling paranoid about their social image within the studied culture.
Here we come to the last.
Dichotomy number 3. Even a good research makes you lonely.
Feeling lonely seems to be a substantial part of ethnography, no matter how far away your research is. One of our interviewees recalled, quote, I just took my car and it was a few kilometers drive and I was there, but being there meant being somewhere completely else, end quote.
Indeed, and I don't know if you remember, but the same researcher told us they had to cut off their friends for the time being in order to separate those two worlds.
Exactly, and it gets even more complex when the two worlds, the professional and the personal, merge, and you become personally involved in the culture and start forming friendships, even intimate relationships with the studied people.
Yes, it is kind of a double edged sword, right? I mean, it gives you closer access to the community, but also navigating this must be very emotionally taxing. One of our interviewees lived for many years with the studied community, and indeed, she said, quote, for many years I was analytically good because I was very in it, but as a person I was not stable, end quote.
I think we are overlooking an important thing here. Let's discuss identity, conformity, and empathy.
What do you mean?
I mean, it's not only the research and researchers' emotionality that gets affected by them being incorporated into a different culture, isn't it?
Oh, you are right. It's also the researcher themselves that gets into transformation. The researcher kind of becomes native. Remember what it was that we heard in one of our interviews. Quote, so, in this sense, within anthropology, we have always this tension between becoming native, becoming maybe one of them, but at the same time, not. We are always trying to navigate because the ideas that we represent or we write about this community as faithfully as we can about them. So the idea is just trying to represent them as the way that they are.
That is true, but there is also another dimension to it. I think that one of our interviewees summed it up really well when she said, quote, we discover ourselves through these experiences, right? So it's not that we are a fixed person and we go to the field work and then we do something about emotions and we come back. It cannot be taught. I think it's about coming of age, of growing, of processing, of becoming adults, of discovering ourselves through the mirroring with other cultures in this case. And it can be very, very painful, but it can also be very, very joyful, end quote.
I see. So actually, it could be said that the researcher's identity developed as they do their research, which is a good point, but how do we think it relates to our research topic?
Well, there's actually a few reasons why I think it's relevant. Firstly, isn't emotionality and gender a big part of our identity?
Yes, of course, but what else?
Your identity and positionality also has an immense role of what topics you choose to focus on in your work. For example, one of our female interviewees said the following, quote, I was sort of staying away from the topic of gender because at that time anthropology was much more male dominated. So it was sort of a default thing. Like, oh, you're a woman, so you can talk about women in the church or whatever. And I was like, no. You can't assume that because I'm a woman, so that was more my colleagues, not the people in the field that I want to write about women. So I was a bit contrary and I stayed away from the topic because of that.
Then there's the fact that how people perceive you has a huge effect on how they interact with you. Remember the quote about being a young female researcher actually proving quite useful for the research?
Of course I do, truly groundbreaking. So what you're saying is that not only it is important how people initially perceive the researcher, but also their position as a researcher within the community develops as the Venn diagrams of their identity and the culture starts overlapping.
Exactly. It seems that people have a tendency to interact with or confide in people they find more similar to them and or to whom they feel more affinity to. So, in relation to gender, for example, not only are some spaces exclusive to one gender and hence closed up to the other ones, but also even beyond the setting, there is just information that is so much easier to obtain when you are of the corresponding gender. And a couple of researchers actually shared that because they were women, they received a lot of intimate information and even advice from the women within the society. One of them said, quote, "It was very nice that all the women, for example, I interviewed sort of started instructing me about what to look out for in a man and how to kiss and things like that. So it was fun." End quote.
You're right. I mean, this is of course highly dependent on the culture, but from the interviews we had, it looks like being a woman could also be a bit beneficial if you want to share your emotions and process them. As one of our interviewees said, quote, "If I had been a woman and were with the women, I think that I could have talked more openly about my sort of emotional and psychological experience."
Precisely. And that's not at all because that also works the other way around. This affinity that is triggered by similarity and or closeness can also prove very beneficial for the researcher as it makes it easier for them to empathize. And as our interviewee said, quote, "The whole exercise of empathy is very important in the fieldwork." End quote.
Ironically, what seems to be quite effective in gaining affinity and insight are often the worst, most traumatizing experiences. One of the researchers described being in mortal danger for a week or so, sleeping with a knife beneath his pillow, and what he said was, quote, "I don't know, it made me sort of sympathize more. I mean, not that I didn't sympathize with them, but like, I don't know, it made me less judgmental. I was never really judgmental, but people are sort of in a rough situation here, and it made me appreciate that more."
I mean, it's kinda rich, especially when remembering the dichotomy between what's good for the researcher versus what's good for the research, right?
You're right. That's where
Boundaries come
come
in.
in.
Exactly. I can imagine it is very hard to set your boundaries, you know? Estimate how far you're willing to go and keep to it.
Yes, remember what the researcher told us about what he would advise to his students if they encountered something uncomfortable while doing research.
Of course. I have it here, he said, quote, "There's something I haven't come to a good solution for yet. You know, what I would be tempted to tell a student if they came to me with that problem is I would say, well, don't compromise. If you're not feeling comfortable with something, you need to tell them what you want. And, you need to say how you're feeling. And I've never been faced with this as a supervisor. No student has ever come to me with this problem before, but I'm thinking, God, what if one does, and what do I tell them? And would I be able to follow that advice myself? I don't know. I mean, that's such a hard thing to do." End quote.
Exactly, it sounds like finding the line between what is helpful versus what is just too much can be quite tricky, especially when you are young and new in the field. That one interviewee glossed this naivety quite well when she said, quote, You can be very like, oh, I want to experience things. I want to really grasp the native point of view, blah, blah. But then you always have to acknowledge the risk that this kind of network can entail, end quote.
Yes, also, there is another reason why, especially inexperienced researchers can struggle with setting clear and appropriate boundaries. And that is the fact that sometimes you realize your boundary has been crossed only in retrospect.
And here's also when where gender becomes quite salient, as most of the cases where the researchers' boundaries were crossed in our study were described by women. And those cases came in all intensity levels, ranging from having to oblige to cultural gender roles that went against the researchers' often feminist worldviews, to the most dire ones, like having to undergo an exorcism, which I think deserves another quote. Quote, it's a bit tricky, the whole idea of conducting field work, and when you go through to an experience that maybe it's too much for you, um, now I would think, I don't know if I would have done this again or in this context. But normally, many things happen during fieldwork, and we have to make many decisions that deal with ethics. So, like this kind of dilemma that I was seeing this interlocutor that was really having a very hard time with my presence, that in her mind I was full of demons and I needed to be exorcised.
End quote. Well, that's heavy. But also, I think that here is one confounding factor that needs to be mentioned, which is religion. We have to keep in mind that the most dire boundaries crossing and most strict rules were indeed directed towards women, but also notably appeared in very orthodox Christian environments.
You're right, very strong beliefs along with the rigidly patriarchal social structure do not sound very welcoming to women. With that being said, it is, however, also true that most cultures in the world are more or less patriarchal, and in the cases of our interviewees, we're talking about less patriarchal societies. They mention it as, well, not really exactly a curiosity, but definitely as something that is not always expected and is worth pointing out.
Exactly. I mean, it also connects to what we said about fieldwork being generally at least seen as more dangerous for women. One researcher described her female students being very careful even about such seemingly small things as going to someone's home in order to do an interview, because they were scared of being attacked and abused.
Yeah, additionally, going back to the power dynamics, do you remember what we said about being a young female researcher?
Do you mean the dichotomy of you not being perceived as a threat and hence being more approachable, but also being perceived as inferior, which makes it super hard for you to assert and protect your boundaries? Yes, I remember. And I have to admit, mentioning it right after pointing out how dangerous fieldwork can be, especially for women, it does not really make me calm and happy.
You're right, being a young researcher, no matter your gender, fieldwork can be really hard to navigate. And so we did ask our experienced interviewees for any advice they could give.
Advice.
I mean, funnily enough, what all researchers agreed on was that you can never really be fully prepared for the emotional load that comes with fieldwork, because emotions are extremely specific both to the person having them and to the particular context.
Too bad. So, what now? Do we just go home or what?
No way, I think that despite the advice being not quite specific and, let's face it, brittle, we can still try to look at the commonalities, like general directions which could be useful regardless of this situation.
Yeah, we can always try, I guess.
Okay, yeah, so what I found very interesting was how one of our interviewees described working with his emotions, not necessarily putting them to the background, but also neither acting upon them, rather observing them, using them as a sort of compass. Literally, what he said was, quote, if you're very enthusiastic about someone or something, or if you're disgusted by something or you're outraged by something, that should make you think more than it should make you act, end quote.
Right, I guess an advice that kind of goes along with it is also the choice of fieldwork because what he said was you should go study a culture that makes you a bit uncomfortable, that kind of pushes you a bit in order to discover something new, you know?
Yes, I think that is a good point, but also in terms of staying there for a significant amount of time, You need to at least the basic conditions to be bearable because otherwise you just leave prematurely and you never finish your work.
You're right, but I also recall another reason why people don't finish what they set out to do. Do you sense what I'm getting at?
Absolutely. What one of our interviewers cautioned us against was having, on the contrary, too much affinity with the studied culture. Quote, yeah, just don't be naive about your emotions. That happens a lot. That you have people who disappear in the field because they get married. You know, like two, three, four people they get married or they join some kind of like a movement.
Yes, he did recommend finishing the research and only then making this sort of life alternating decisions.
Another reason why you should be a bit skeptical about your immediate emotions is that you can get really paranoid and over analytical, which can make the whole experience much more stressful than it needs to be.
Indeed. But no matter what you do, there are always going to be emotional challenges. You can't really prevent that from happening. And besides common techniques such as journaling or engaging in other soothing activities, what seems to be quite important for our interviewees was to have a confidant, someone whom you can tell what is really going on and who does have the capacity to understand you.
Agreed. Opinions differ on who it should be, whether a psychologist, a good friend, a partner, or a colleague with a similar experience. The message is pretty clear in saying that you should not make yourself feel even more alone than you need to be, and you definitely should have someone to vent to.
Also, another point that I noticed is that focusing on the actual work and reminding yourself how grateful you are actually to have such an opportunity was very helpful to see the big picture, zoom out a bit.
You are making a good point here, but what I think is also important to mention is that researchers noted that this kind of emotional part has been neglected in their preparation. Quote, nobody told me. I mean, I guess I could have, I guess I knew it, but like you prepare for this doing masters and it's all about theory, it's all about analysis. Nobody tells you that you're going to have to like pretend to not be traumatized when narco traffickers come, you know?
I mean, it sounds pretty hard, and not only to the researchers, but also for their mentors and supervisors. Because, you can't really educate people on their own emotions because, well, firstly, you don't know how they feel, and secondly, assuming you could know sounds a bit intrusive and patronizing. Moreover, the advice needs to be specific to the context, and even in case you happen to be an expert in the relevant context, still, there are ambivalent situations that the mentors themselves do not know how to act in, as we talked about in relation to setting and keeping your boundaries.
Yes, but whilst we did hear voices pointing out the neglect of prevalent issues connected to fieldwork, such as depression or sexual assault, we did pick up a trend of improvement in this direction. One of the researchers, for example, compared the situation that is now versus when she did her studies. Quote, there's now also a working group on sexual harassment in the field, for example, in an anthropology organization in the Netherlands. And that was not a topic when I was studying. End quote. And our youngest participant actually mentioned he did feel well prepared.
Exactly, and also our interviewees that actively supervise a lot of people actually did mention the discrepancy between their rather unemotional education and the attentive and perhaps more holistic education they try to give to their students. So, what I am saying is, we have a positive message here. Yay! I mean, that's it, we're done.
Not that fast. I think we should summarize our main points before we skip into the sunshine.
Summary. Yeah, let's quick revisit them all.
Firstly, we talked about gender limitations in research. We addressed limited access to research topics, social spheres, the need for women to prove themselves, and possible dangers in the field.
Later, we moved on to gender performances, which revealed very clear expectations for women and salient social pressures for men.
After that, we mentioned the main finding, which was based on repetitive answers that certain decisions researchers undertook were good for the research but traumatic or demanding personally.
Further, we noted the constantly developing researcher's identity influenced by boundary crossing, conformity, etc.
And lastly, we concluded with general advice that experienced researchers wanted to share with young students.
We would very much like to thank our teachers Peter and Matilda that guided us through this beautiful project.
And the biggest thank you goes to the researchers that agreed to talk to us about these sensitive topics.
And thank also you all for listening. I hope it was interesting too. Goodbye.
Goodbye.